afternoon, everyone. I hope people can hear me and I don't appear to be yelling, do I? It's okay? All right. Well, I'm Sonia Hurt, and I'm the Dean of the College of Environment and Design. Welcome to this wonderful event, and thank you all for coming. I understand we are competing with the beautiful weather outside, and I understand this is a very busy time of the semester for all of us. So thank you again for taking the time. You are in for a special treat today at the chapel. I think this is a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity, although for me it's twice-in-a-lifetime opportunity to hear Dr. Adam Gopnik, who is one of the world's most renowned art and culture critiques and most prolific and engaging authors of our time. Dr. Gopnik has been writing for The New Yorker since the year 1986. He has written hundreds of essays, memoirs, reviews, reports from abroad, fiction, humor, and art criticism. His books range from essay collections about Paris, where he lived for many years, and food, to children's novels, and they include, and several of them, by the way, do not forget, are available for sale. The book titles include Paris to the Moon, The King in the Window, Through the Children's Gate, A Home in New York, Angels and Ages, a short book about Darwin, Lincoln, and modern life. The Table Comes First, 5 Windows on the Season, At the Stranger's Gate, and his latest, 1,000 Small Sanities, The Moral Adventures of Liberalism. Dr. Gopnik has won the National Magazine Award for Essays and Criticism 3 times, as well as the George Polk Award for Magazine Reporting. He holds a doctorate honoris causa from his alma mater, McGill University, as well as the Rhode Island School of Design. He recently, and for the second time, received the Medal of Honor by the President of the French Republic. Dr. Gopnik's lecture today is entitled Catching the Bullet, and he will share his thoughts on a number of subjects, including on the importance of bridging the arts and sciences, something which I believe our college truly specializes in. So please join me in welcoming Dr. Gopnik.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you, Sonia. Thank you all for coming. It's wonderful to be here. This is my first official visit to Athens and to UGA, but I have been at home here spiritually for a very long time. And let me tell you why. I was blessed. One of my subjects today is the nature of teaching and how we learn to do things well. And I was blessed and learned everything I know about teaching and talking from a great Georgian, Kirk Varnado, who was my teacher at the Institute of Fine Arts. And I should add, actually, that though Sonia was generous enough to call me Dr. Gopnik, my doctorates are indeed honorary, and I come from a very large academic family. I have 6 brothers and sisters, and they all have honest-to-God doctorates. I am the only one without one. That's what we refer to in my part of the world as a Jewish dropout. I'm past my orals in 1984, and I am 37 years ABD right now. Thank you. But the teacher who I failed to matriculate with was the great Kirk Varnado, director of the Museum of Modern Art, and he had many passions in life. We lost him ridiculously young 20 years ago, but one of his greatest passions was the Georgia Bulldogs. And his brother, Gordon Batman Varnado, was a regular at Georgia Bulldog games for some 40 years. I wrote to him to tell him I was finally coming to UGA and found tragically that he had died earlier this year, just in April. So this talk is very much dedicated to his memory and to the misconnection that we didn't get to be here together. But there were countless Saturdays when Kirk and I watched the Bulldogs play. He never missed a game if he could help it. And one of his key memories in life was having accompanied Uga to the Sugar Bowl in New Orleans sometime in the early 70s when he was 12 or 13 years old, and of spending an utterly sleepless night while Uga breathed hard in the other room. So though this is my first actual corporeal visit to Athens, I feel that it is very much one of my spiritual homes. I wanted to talk tonight a little bit about the nature of mastery, and Kirk Varnado was certainly one of those masters I learned from. And he, at one point in his life, had to make a decision. He was at Stanford University about whether he was going to go on in art history or become a football coach. He was working for the great Bill Walsh as a defensive backfield coach. And he had a dark night of the soul when he had to decide, and he finally said to me he chose art history because the thing about being a football coach is that it's one of those things that you have to be smart enough to do it well and dumb enough to think it matters, which you could say, I think, about pretty much every choice we make in life and every concentration we choose. But what I wanted to talk about tonight is exactly the places where the arts and sciences intersect in our conception of mastery, of being able to do things well. Not just to do things well, but to do things with the kind of elan and panache that we emulate and admire when we see it. When Kirk Varnedoe was teaching, when a great magician is working, our response is not simply to admire it as science, as a series of engineered effects. Our response is to dive into it as humanity, as an astonishing revelation of the potential and possibilities of the human spirit. And trying to walk that line between the science of mastery, what psychology and neuroscience can teach us about that process, and the aesthetics of mastery, what we have to turn to the arts and humanities to understand, is very much the subject of what I've been reflecting on in my 2-year lockdown. And I should add that this is my first return to speaking since March of 2020. Yes, thank us all that this is happening. And this is what I've been thinking about for those 2 years. The Real Work is the title of a piece I did about magicians a few years ago. But the reason I called it The Real Work, and I'm thinking of writing a book with that title, is because magicians, when they're considering this question, this problem of mastery, have a beautiful term that they always use, and it's exactly the real work. They ask each other if they're considering an illusion. One of the beautiful things about spending time with magicians, and I once got to spend a whole month in Las Vegas just following magicians around. It's where all of them work, and many of them, like Penn and Teller, for instance, live in a kind of permanent exile from the East Village of New York. When they're speaking to each other, and they have the most beautiful shop talk of any artists in the world, because they can only talk to each other about what it is they do. Writers have the most tedious shop talk, because all we can talk about is what kind of laptop we use and how big our last advance was, and we lie about that anyway. Magicians have wonderful shop talk because they can only tell each other about the secrets of their work. It's totally closed off to everyone else. And when they're talking about that, when they say, who first did Flosso's money box, or who first did the illuminated skeleton, they don't say who first did it. They say, who's got the real work on that? Who's got the real work on that? And by the real work, they mean who has put it together, not who did it first, not even who does it with the most technical perfection. What they mean is who has mastered the entirety of the effect in the most compelling way possible. That's what they mean by the real work. And I see people nodding because whenever I say that to people, everyone knows instantly what I'm referencing, even if you've never heard the phrase before. And we all know in our own particular fields who's got the real work on any particular part of it. And it isn't synonymous with, it isn't continuous with who knows the most about a subject. We know who's got the real work on a subject. And another way, and this is where the puzzling title of my talk today, Catching the Bullet, comes from, another way of illuminating that very much from the world of magic, does indeed supply my title tonight, and it also supplies the original impetus of this whole series of investigations. My son Luke was, when he was 12 and 13, obsessed, as so many bright kids are, with card magic. And all he was interested in was doing magic and making magic. And I was so struck by it at the time because the difference between what he was being taught in school and what he was teaching himself was so evidently powerful. At school, he was being taught the art of achievement, right? Being drilled to do the next test and to get beyond it. By himself, in his bed at night, with a deck of cards perpetually in his hand, he was learning the magic of accomplishment, of what it is to be really good at something. And the difference between the brutal, driven nature of achievement in our culture particularly, and the glorious rewards of accomplishment weighed very hard on me. So when he asked me if he could take time off from school, from high school, to go to work as David Blaine's personal assistant, I said yes. Everybody thought I was making a terrible mistake in allowing him to do that, but he had met David Blaine. Everyone knows who David Blaine is, the great stunt man and magician. Lady is nodding her head. He's probably the greatest living stunt man in the Houdini tradition. And when Luke was working with him, and being David Blaine's PA is one of the great jobs you can possibly have, especially if you're 13 or 14 years old, because you spend your life going to the veterinarian with the albino alligator, or keeping the Russian models from knowing the other one is on the way at that time. It was a whole complicated, wonderful introduction to the world for Luke. But one of the things that David Blaine was working at while Luke was working with him was what's called the bullet catch. The bullet catch. And the bullet catch is a legendary act in magic and in vaudeville. And usually when it's done now, it's what it sounds like, right? Somebody points a rifle at the magician. The magician has a cup in his mouth. The rifle goes off. The bullet ends in the cup while the magician stands there with his mouth wide open, takes the bullet out and shows it to you. Legendary and extremely dangerous trick. It's so dangerous, and so many early magicians in the 20th century were killed on stage doing it, that almost invariably now it's done as a gaffe. It's done as a trick, done as a gimmick. If you go see Penn and Teller, they do it, but they do it without apology as a trick. And so I asked Luke, how was David Blaine going to do it? What was he doing? And he said, oh no, David's going to do it the right way. David's going to do it the authentic way. And I said, he is? Well, there must be a trick. And he said, no. He said, it's a very, very strong titanium cup he'll have in his mouth. And it's a low velocity rifle and a small caliber bullet. And it'll be laser guided. You see the green laser guide goes right to his mouth, so it can't miss. And that's how he's going to do it. And I said, oh, so really? There's no trick to the bullet catch, Luca? And Luca looked at me and he said, oh no, Dad, there's a very big trick to the bullet catch. And I said, well, what is it? And he said, the trick to the bullet catch is catching the bullet. I heard in your laughter, right, that you recognize the joke and then you recognize the truth, because it's something we all know again in each of our worlds, right? The trick to doing anything is actually doing it, and the inhibition we have most often is the inhibition of standing there and doing it. The trick to the bullet catch is catching the bullet in the immediate sense that you have to trust your preparation. You have to be prepared, as David Blaine was, to stand there with the cup in your mouth and believe that the low caliber gun and the small weight, low caliber bullet and the accurate gun and the laser guiding was all going to work and empower you, enable you to do it. And in all of the work we all do, that's exactly what's involved. It's trusting our preparation sufficiently to be able to do the hugely difficult thing. And what struck me as I began a kind of enterprise in explicating and understanding the nature of mastery is that it always comes down to the trick to the bullet catch is catching the bullet. In whatever field or area you are, you finally have to stand there, and the hardest thing to do is to believe in the power of your own mastery to make it happen. I am now going to go to a completely different seeming place to try and illuminate the same point from another point of view. And I warn you that this lecture will seem to you at first extremely digressive and then finally collect itself into a point. I don't know how many of you remember the great California artist Ed Ruscha used to say that the thing about bad art is that it makes you say first, wow, and then, huh? And the thing about good art is you say first, huh? And then you say, wow. So there will be many huhs in this lecture, but I hope that they will combine into a wow at the end. Don't tell me if they don't. But this is the first huh. I want to talk a little bit about the nature of mastery, and particularly in the context for the beginning of the talk of the history of magic, by talking about the chess-playing automaton of the 18th century called the Turk. Some of you may have heard about it or read about it over time. This was a fully wrought automaton, and here's a recreation of it by the American illusionist John Gagin, that was wheeled around Europe throughout the end of the 18th century. And it would be set up, as you can see, with this extraordinarily complicated clockwork mechanisms inside it, and it was clearly an automaton, and you would go up, and the exhibitor would open all of those cabinet drawers to show you there was no one hidden inside, there was nothing inside it, there was nothing in it but machinery. Then he would close it up, and then you would be challenged to go up and play chess with the automaton. And the automaton would invariably win. The automaton defeated, the Turk as it was called, defeated Benjamin Franklin and Napoleon and countless other significant figures. And one of the great questions that filled people's minds at the end of the 18th century was, how did the damn thing work? How did the damn thing work to enable it as a machine to defeat a human being in a game of chess? It was so widespread that Richard Babbage, the father of computing, saw it, the differential engine as it was called, and said, how would that thing work? Well, let's start at a simpler level and we'll begin to do it. So in many ways it is at the origins of modern computing. Edgar Allan Poe, great Southern writer, wrote an entire study of it in which he said the only way it can work is by some kind of imposture in which an incredibly gifted midget or an abused child must be secreted somewhere in the apparatus, and there must exist in the world this amazing miniature-sized chess master who can do it. The answer, when it finally was exposed, was that there was indeed a full-grown man inside the Turk who was on a little sled with ball-bearing pulleys on it, and as Kemplin, the man who invented and owned the automaton, would demonstrate it and open the doors, he slid, as you can see in this diagram, he slid in and out of place so that he could be hidden as the drawers were opened and then slide back in when it came time to play and control the movements of the Ottoman's arms. He was an Ottoman automaton, arms with a pointer, with a cleverly designed girder and pivot system. Where did Kemplin get this brilliant chess player who he could fit within the machinery? Well, that's in a sense the most astonishing thing and the most important part of the story. There was no drug-addicted chess genius who he had enslaved. There was no astonishingly gifted little person who could do it. There was no child. In every city where he went to demonstrate the Turk, he would go to the local chess club and find somebody and say, do you need a gig and do you mind working in very close quarters? No more to it than that. There was no chess master hidden inside. There was a series of good chess players who he called on to do it. Now think about that for a second. Kemplin's real genius was not to have built a successful chess-playing machine. His real genius was to understand something that's very true about modern life and that we too soon forget. And that is that mastery is widely available in the modern world. There are a lot of good chess players in Berlin and London and Paris in 1790, lots of them. Mastery is very widely distributed. What's not as widely distributed is genius, is the ability to be a dominant figure. That's still true about chess today. Countless really amazing, terrific chess players, but only 2 or 3 who can compete at the very highest levels. It's true about music. If you've ever been a musician, a guitarist, say, you are astounded by how widespread the mastery of the guitar is, and yet there are only 3 or 4 names we know. So one thing Kemplin understood intuitively is that mastery is much more widely disseminated in the modern world than we sometimes choose to acknowledge, and that he could leverage that understanding to create the illusion of a perfectly working automaton. But the other thing he realized, of course, I'm sure has leapt into your mind, is that the way you make a good chess player into a great chess player is to hide him in a cabinet like this, right? That you get, that it's exactly through the totality of the effect, the theatricality of it, the ability to intimidate you with this seemingly overwhelming mechanical marvel, that a good chess player becomes a great chess player, that it creates the environment, the frigidity, if you want, the impressiveness of it that made the automaton unbeatable. And no one ever did beat it. You take a good chess player, you secrete him inside a machinery like this, you create a set of powerful theatrical effects, and suddenly you have a great chess player on hand. Here's a more complicated version of exactly how the man was hidden within, the chess player was hidden within the machine. I'm going to leap subjects in just a second onto another kind of mastery. So I got fascinated by exactly that question. How is it that mastery works? And realized that the model of the Turk, the Ottoman automaton, is not a bad model in a way. That mastery is very widely spread, and that it often involves as much an orchestrated illusion as it does a checklist of numerable attractions or skills. In my search to understand mastery, I decided to do something that is extremely blasphemous for an art critic to do, and I worked as an art critic, the New Yorker's art critic, for almost a decade, and that is to actually learn to draw. I realized that in all of my time thinking about art, looking about art, pontificating about art, opining about art, kicking artists around, patting them on the head to praise them, all of that, I had no idea how to actually draw a thing in the world. So I decided to start studying with an extraordinary man who you see here, whose name is Jacob Collins, who's one of the great masters of representational, old master style, illusionistic drawing that's left. Jacob is a fascinating guy because in outer appearance, he's a New York dad like me. Our kids went to the same school. He seems to have all the same attitudes. But Jacob truly hates modern art. Now, you know people who are sort of allergic to modern art, I'm sure. You say, I don't get that, Jeff Koons, right? Or could you explain to me what Andy Warhol is all about? We all know people like that. I mean, when I say Jacob hates modern art, I mean he hates Cézanne. I mean he hates Van Gogh. He thinks everything that's happened in art since 1855 is a complete fraud. Actually, very smart guy, and he believes we have to go back to the classic Beaux-Arts drawing traditions that precede modernism. Now, I didn't get the PhD, or I should say I got the PhD I didn't get in modern art, so I come from a totally different place. But I wanted to study drawing not with someone who would indulge my foibles and tell me, oh, like the way teachers in a progressive school do. Oh, it's wonderful, we'll put it up on the refrigerator right away. I wanted to study with somebody who was a real hard ass, who was really not going to play ball with my own lack of skill or tell me that my lack of skill was identical with my self-expression. So I started studying and went on for 2 years to study with Jacob Collins, to study the art of life drawing. I could not have been worse at doing it, and I still am terrible at doing it, but I learned so much in the process of understanding what it was that Jacob does, what it is that a great draftsman is capable of doing. And it's a fascinating thing, because what you find out is that when you spend all day in a studio staring at a naked human body, male, female, whatever it might be, and you're struggling to make sense of how you take what you're looking at and turn it into a set of marks on a piece of white or beige paper, the first thing you really learn is that you can't do it by drawing what you see. That's an almost meaningless injunction, draw what you see. You see everything. You see a maze. You see a labyrinth of shade. You don't ever see line, actual line in the world. You see a mess of light that you have to somehow interpret and turn into a drawing. And when I was studying with Jacob, to my surprise, I found that what he was teaching me was not to learn to see better in any way, but instead to replace one symbol set, one symbolic system, with another. What do I mean by that? Well, the simplest symbol set we use to describe and draw things in the world is the one that children use and that I was still inhabiting at an advanced age. You draw a circle, right? You draw two eyes, you draw a smile and a nose, right? None of them have any actual relationship to where eyes, noses, and mouths are positioned on a face in the world. But we use that as our conventional symbol set to represent, to suggest, to symbolize a face. And the first job of someone learning to draw illusionistically in the manner of the old masters is not to discard that symbol set simply, but to replace that symbol set with another symbol set. So when I would be staring at the incoherent side, or incoherent to me side of a nude model, Jacob would say, well, don't you see in the pattern of shadow some other form? Maybe you see the profile of a snooty butler with his nose raised up in the air. Or maybe you can see the map of an imaginary African state within that play of shadow. Find those forms, find the forms that you're not used to searching for, and you'll be able to describe that light, and you'll be able to break out of the symbol set that enslaves your eye at the moment. And so hour after hour after hour, I would sit there with a pencil and staring, just trying to find those aberrant forms, those snooty butlers, those South American countries that would enable me to see past and break past my symbol set to find another. Now, what's fascinating about it is that as you begin to compile those symbol sets, I never got past the first stage of this, as here. One subroutine, one bit of broken symbol making would compile and be placed on top of another, so you would go from the schematic drawing to the completed drawing. Believe me, I never got anywhere near here. I got to the first level at most. But that was the nature of learning to draw. It wasn't learning to see the world. It was learning to discard one set of symbols and learn how to begin to organize another set that would have the qualities that we recognize as the representation of the world. Another test, another exam or practice, another heuristic that Jacob would give me often, I'm sure if any of you have studied life drawing, you've done this too, was to simply look at a face and to break that symbol set I was talking about a moment ago, where you have the simplified schematic eyes, nose, and mouth, and simply look at a face, I'm looking at a face right here, as a clock, right? And say, where exactly, if this is a clock face, right, where exactly does your eyebrow fall? Well, it falls right about 1 minute before 11, right? And or 1 minute before 1, I should say, on the other side there. And then where does your smile line fall? Well, it falls right about 4 o'clock. If I start looking at your face as a clock face, then I can actually begin to compute where those lines are in a way that I can't if I'm still trying to impose my schematic symbol set upon it. That's a very useful heuristic for breaking out of your familiar symbol set. The whole point here is that the business of drawing is very much like the business of putting the chess player inside the machine. That is, it's not simply expertise that you learn in a naive or transparent way from the world. It's a complicated intersection of many different kinds of tricks, conceits, illusions, skills, and subroutines that are brought together in a way that finally makes them look like transparent mastery, when in fact they're a complicated, illusionistic play of tricks. Tricks in the best sense, not in the sense of deceit, but tricks in the best sense, in the sense that of the way that we learn to master and fool and seduce people. And there, finally, is Jacob's vision of your speaker at the end, which he gave me at the end of our 2-year immersion in life drawing. The next activity I went after was to learn to drive. Having learned to draw, I then decided I would learn to drive. Now, for most of you, of course, I'm sure, learning to drive is something you did when you were 12 or 13 or 14, and you passed your license when you were 16, and you never thought about it again. I see a lot of recognition. I learned to drive when I was 56. And in fact, I believe to this day that I am the only human being in New York State who took his first driving exam on exactly the same day as his 20-year-old son. We went together to suburban New York, and in sequence, we did our driving exams with the driving instructor. Now, driving, for most of us, as I say, is a model of a totally transparent activity, right? It's when you're good at it, as most Americans are. I have the excuse of being Canadian. But beyond that, I also have the excuse of having lived in New York most of my life, and it's the one aberrant city where nobody drives or owns a car. What you learn is that driving is not the transparent thing that we can sometimes imagine it to be, or that it is for those who have started very early on. Again, it has the same qualities, the same characteristics as learning to draw. That is, what you learn are a set of fixed subroutines, of fixed schematic advances that, when you then put them all together, allow you to navigate yourself around in the world. If you do it at 16, all of the subroutines and schematic advances are completely natural inside your body, and your muscles do the things, and you don't even think about the fact that you're driving. If you do it when you're 56, trust me, you're super self-conscious at every moment about everything that you're doing. I had a wonderful driving instructor, a guy named Arturo, and Arturo was teaching you, A, how to pass the driving test, and B, he was teaching you how to perform as a driver as much as be a driver. So he had a big sign up on his front, a wonderful guy from Ecuador, that said, "Be the noodle, be the noodle." And he meant by that, just relax your body at every moment. Don't let yourself get tensed up if you're driving. Be the busy bee was another thing he had written up, which meant check your mirrors at every moment, partly because the driving judges like you to be always looking back and forth from your mirrors to show that you've mastered the performance of driving. And if you think about it, one of the things that driving is not just a matter of mastering a set of keys and pedals and directions. It has within it a certain kind of performance. One of Arturo's favorite things to have me do was what he called the hand. He said, always use the hand. Use the hand to look at the people in the car next to you. Use the hand to signal to a cop. He said the hand means thank you, the hand means bless you, the hand means fuck you, and the hand can mean anything you want it to mean. But it was an important part of becoming engaged with another driver, because one of the things that makes driving so crazily dangerous, as you realize if you come to it late in life, is exactly that you are enclosed within your own world, and whereas when we're pedestrians, we are in constant human contact with other pedestrians. Our eyes are making contact with them. We're registering them as individuals. When you're in a car, you are, in a sense, mind blind. You don't actually think of the other person in the car as being somebody with the same agency that you have. They simply seem to be an object in the world, and you don't imbue them with, it's an actual phrase in psychology, the opacity of agency, right? In some circumstances, we have enormous transparency of agency. We recognize that somebody else is a person like us who's trying to navigate a maze in the same way we are. But then there are times when there's total opacity of agency. We don't know what the other person is doing. We may not even recognize that a machine is being run by another person. And that's one of the reasons why there are so many accidents, is opacity of agency in the way cars work together. And one of the things you learn to do unconsciously or subconsciously or by routine is to add a note of agency to your driving, if it's only the hand. I show you this slide because that story about learning to drive was turned into a play called The Driver's Seat in San Francisco, in which I made a guest appearance starring as myself. I continue this line of inquiry, this line of research, of thinking in many other settings. Forgive me, I'm not checking the baseball scores. I'm just checking my notes here. Music, for one. I became fascinated by music. I love music. I write musical comedy. And I play some guitar. We were talking about it at lunch today. And I play some piano. But one of the things that makes music so the most interesting to me, of all the skills that we can master, of all the performances that we can take part in, is that music simultaneously is a set of mathematical relationships of vibrating columns of air, and it's the most powerful emotional map we ever can have of our own lives. We all feel that way, right? That when we try and organize our own emotional history, we do it around songs and music that we've heard. We don't do it around almost anything else, and we don't ever think of those songs and that music as having been produced by the series of mathematical vibrations that in fact produces them. I got particularly interested in this because I was doing a Moth evening. I don't know if any of you ever listened to The Moth, the storytelling shows that I participate in. And there was a spectrum, a guy, an engineer who was on the spectrum, and he had become expert as an audio engineer in exactly the technical, the traceable, the mathematical part of musical engineering, and then had actually had, this sounds like something out of a bad movie or a young adult book, but it's true. He'd actually had a series of electrode implants which had helped his condition in a way that suddenly made music meaningful for him for the first time. And he was overwhelmed for the first time in his 30s by the emotional content of music, which had always been opaque to him, again, inert to him before. And the recognition of the emotional content of music was so overwhelming for him that he had to give up his work as an audio engineer for a while because he could not listen with the same clinical detachment that he had always possessed before. And I got to thinking to myself, well, what accounts for that? How can you explain it? So I went up to my alma mater, McGill University, where there's a whole lab in psychoacoustics, in the neuroscience of music. And I spoke to Daniel Levitin, who's a wonderful scientist and musician, wrote a good book called This Is Your Mind on Music. And up at McGill, Daniel Levitin had invented an expressive piano. That is a piano that you could play with the dimensions and see how pleasing or unpleasing they were to people. And what they discovered, unsurprisingly, but very often the most interesting discoveries in neuroscience are self-evident things that all humanists knew already, but that they're able to attach data and quantifiable information to, was that anything that accurately, perfectly reproduced the notes on a score was unappealing to people, and that there was a dimension of imperfection that made music emotionally powerful. And if you think about it, as I say, this is something every musician knows instinctively. We make music from those columns of vibrating air into music by bending the notes. We do it through vibrato. We do it through legato. We do it through all of the ways in which we imbue a mechanical pattern with the quiddity of humanity, all of those ways that create and project imperfection into music in order to give it that human dimension. And you can trace this quite precisely on the expressive piano, what those dimensions are. And obviously, when they go too far, it ceases to be meaningful as music and just bends over into undifferentiated noise. So there's a funny internal continuum that we all have with zombie-like perfection at one end and mere noise at the other end. And there's a sweet spot that we call music where mechanical perfection and human imperfection intersect significantly. Once again, though totally different world, similar kind of point, right, to the notion of mastery in drawing, the idea that it isn't simply being able photographically to capture the image of light in the world, but that it's an interpretive element that involves a great many highly artificial routines and subroutines superimposed one upon another, not that different from the lesson of the Turk and the automaton, that what makes an extraordinarily impressive mechanical chess player is not simply the quality of the chess player inside, but the totality of the organized theatrical effect. Again, something very similar happens when we look at music. And to come back to my original subject, it's something that magicians understand extremely well. I show you a picture here of probably the greatest magician of the 20th century, Di Vernon, who's a Canadian, by the way. And what Vernon mastered more than anyone else was exactly this. What he called it naturalism. He said that every move that a magician ever made should look completely continuous with actual performance of hands in the world. That anything that looked like magic was bad magic, was unsuccessful magic. And he had been enormously influenced by this man who is one of these men. It's one of the most interesting mysteries in the history of American magic. There was the author of the book that influenced Erdnase, his most influential book in modern magic history. It's called the expert at the card table is someone named S.W. Erdnase, and it's clearly a pseudonym, and 100+ years later, we still don't know who it's the pseudonym for. It seems to be an anagram for somebody named Andrews, but there are many, many Andrews who have been submitted as potential candidates, and just this year, there's a book by the greatest living card cheat, a man named Steve Forte, that says Erdnase himself was a fake and never could have existed because the things he describes are not things that any card cheat would do. But I'll spare you the complexities of the Erdnase thing just to say that this idea, right, that you should have the magic you do with cards should be completely natural, relied, and this is something that Vernon learned from Erdnase, on the appearance of imperfection. That anything that looked perfect at the card table would immediately give itself away as cheating, right? And that one of the things that you had to master was the appearance of imperfection. And this has blossomed in the magic world into something called too perfect trick theory. It's actually what magicians call it, too perfect trick theory. And that is the idea that any time you do something as an illusion that is completely perfect, it will fail to entertain your audience, but the way it's done will be instantly apparent to them. This is a famous example of it, the cigarette through coin, right? You put the cigarette through the coin, just baldly, right? And the audience says, oh, there's some kind of hinge inside the coin that allows the cigarette to pass through it. If you do it in a much more complicated, orchestrated series of effects, where you switch out one coin for another, you allow someone to examine the coin and see that there is no hinge in it, then you take it back, then you pass it through, then you do the substitution again. As part of an elaborate, orchestrated series of effects, cigarette through coin could work. As something that's simply done in itself, the perfection of the illusion immediately provides the information of its artificiality. And if you think about it, it's exactly the same kind of phenomenon that you see with the expressive piano. Something that is mechanically perfect is aesthetically unsatisfying. And that general rule, I think, is one that passes through all of the arts and through all of our mastery of them. And if we could expand this discussion, and I hope to expand it in a book, to almost every corner of the aesthetic universe, and indeed to the universe of mastery, of genius. That is, that one of the things we learn most potently and powerfully when we're studying is not just the technical perfection of our form, but how to seed in enough noise against the signal. People talk about this all the time. How to seed in enough imperfection to make it humanly compelling. Two things, I think, are terribly important to see from everything I've been talking about. First, that if we want to study mastery, we can learn an enormous amount from the neuroscientists, we can learn an enormous amount from the engineers, and we can learn an enormous amount, obviously, from historians. But it's finally a field and a world in which the humanities have it over the sciences. We're always told, again and again these days, that there will be some kind of science that will explain things that we naturally thrive with and things that we naturally find compelling in the world, that there'll be a science of storytelling or a science of siblings. Many of my siblings are scientists, so I am not allergic to this idea. But when we actually bear down on the nature of mastery in the arts, or if we bear down on the nature of mastery even in entertainment, what we find instead is this orchestration of individualities. What we find is all of the elements having to be brought together in some kind of complexly orchestrated illusion that necessarily will evade any significant rule, any one rule, exactly because its power depends on the power of surprise, on the fact that we're putting it together for you in some way that we couldn't have done before. We were talking at lunch today about the Rolling Stones, right? And one of the things that makes rock music powerful is that it creates those rituals of imperfection, distorted sound, which no one had ever before used exactly for the same reason. The distorted sound of Keith Richards' guitar is a variation on the vibrato of a classical violinist, but it's not one that anyone would have anticipated before the great electric guitarists began to use it. So that every time we experience mastery, in its nature, we must be experiencing something that depends on the quiddity of an individual. It's something that the humanities and the arts have inhabited as long as we have had them, and that will always, I believe, escape any one rule. That it escapes any one rule doesn't mean that it escapes rationality. We can study it, we can understand it, we can analyze it, but we can still recognize that the range of mastery, whether it's something as remarkable as Jacob Collins' classical drawing, or something as trivial as learning to drive a car in your mature years, that all of these things depend not on one set of mechanical rules, but an immensely complicated recipe of vectors, subroutines, and possibilities that drive in on us together. And finally, the other thing we recognize, I think, running right through the story from the Turk on, is exactly that the power of mastery is reciprocal power. It depends on the relationship between a performer of some kind and an audience. That we never actually master things on our own. It has no meaning to talk about mastery outside the context of an audience, outside the context of a performance. And it's exactly that dialogue of imperfection that enables us to be engrossed by, to be brought into mastery. If we watch too perfect a trick, it has no interest for us at all. It's exactly in our ability to grasp and understand those imperfections that we are moved and turn around. And as I wrote once about this very subject, and I hope you'll forgive me if I end by reading you something that I did write. Mastery isn't just something that we do in isolation. It isn't something that you can do in your closet or your own bedroom. It only has meaning if done within a social context. And what I've been trying to suggest and to sketch to you today is that social context is a kind of interactive, dynamic exchange in which the Turk, so to speak, works for us and astonishes us exactly because it opens up so many doors of possible explanation. A great piano player registers for us as a transmitter of emotion exactly because she makes us enter into a game of interpretation where what we hear is not simply music being made, but the musician making it. That's what mastery is all about, and that's what makes mastery possible. That's exactly the sense in which I think we need to understand the connection between drawing and music and magic and driving, between the iPhone in your hand and the Turk on stage in Baltimore in the late 18th century. Whatever the context of communication, whatever it might be, the empathetic exchange between minds is satisfying only when it's dynamic, unfinished, unresolved. Friendships, flirtations, even love affairs depend, like magic tricks, on the constant exchange of incomplete and tantalizing information. Frauds may master our minds, but only frauds master them. Real masters, like poets, engage them in a permanent maze of possibility. The trick, always, the task of the arts and the task that the arts hand on to the sciences is to always renew the possibilities. Thank you very much.